So Sonic Superstars has been around long enough now that we've had enough time to dissect the game, we've had enough time to speak on it, we've had enough time to crap on it, all the verbiage you can think of. And I think it's time that we finally figure out what's the deal with these stages. Now, Sonic Superstars has 11 fresh new stages going for it. So there's a lot of content here, there's a lot to speak on. And what I've decided to do is to go through and to figure out what are the bad ones and what are the good ones. More specifically, I'm here to figure out which stage in Sonic Superstars is the best. Which is the creme to the creme, if you will. While Sonic Superstars stages are pretty good to very good across the board, there are distinct differences between them that make it so that it's easy to weed out the bad from the good. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and start this off by weeding out the bad. The bottom tier that has no business being in the same breath as the top tier, so yeah, that's what we're going to do here. Let's start out with the absolute worst zone in this game, without a doubt. We have Egg Fortress Zone. Egg Fortress Zone is a mistake. Egg Fortress Zone is your prototypical final Eggman zone where you're in Eggman's big fortress base thing and you have to make it to the end. And naturally with the final zone in Sonic games, there's plenty of traps, plenty of enemies, plenty of gimmicks that are here to slow you down, and they slow you down to a huge detriment. The thing about Egg Fortress Zone, it refuses to allow you to pick up any amount of momentum. Not even like the littlest amount where you can just kind of walk along at a leisurely pace. No, it will try to stop you from moving at all at any possibility that it has to do so. There will be sections where you will be floating through the air and you have to dodge lasers, 007 James Bond style. There's also sections where you have to stop in these rooms and you have to destroy these laser machines that are trying to zap you. And then there are also sections where you are rising up through the air on a spinning platform while there are these fire mechanisms trying to burn you alive. And once again, all these gimmicks are just here to slow this stage's pace to a crawl. It's horrible. And when it comes to Act 2, they managed to make things even worse for you. They literally just decided, hey, why don't we just reverse Act 1 and make it so that you do the whole thing in reverse? I'm not sure if they thought that this was the smartest, most innovative thing that you could ever do, or if they literally just ran out of time and just had to literally copy-paste this and reverse it in Adobe Premiere. I don't know. Either way, Egg Fortress Zone belongs at the bottom of the barrel. It's terrible and I want to forget about it forever. And now let's talk about Frozen Base Zone. There's nothing inherently wrong with Act 1 of Frozen Base Zone. It's a pretty solid little zone where you're running along these tracks that you can switch the movement of going backward or forward. And what I like about it is it allows you to keep the speed up. It allows you to maintain a lot of speed, and I do enjoy that. I also enjoy the winter vibes. I'm a sucker for winter vibes in my games. But the problem comes with its second act. The second act isn't a Sonic stage, it's a shooty stage, which, this is completely out of pocket for a Sonic game here. You're basically just mashing the A and B button to destroy various enemies, and then you have to fight a couple of mini-bosses on top of that. This isn't Sonic. This has nothing to do with Sonic, and I don't know what Sonic Team's obsession is with creating that one random zone where you do something completely unrelated to Sonic. So Frozen Base Zone, I'm sorry, but you're going to the bottom of the barrel too. You are completely out of the picture here, and we are just going to try and forget about you. Press Factory Zone, if you watched my previous videos on this game, you'll know that I am not super fond of this zone. The Act 1 gimmick where every 5 or so seconds a giant pressing machine tries to launch you up into the air, overall I still feel that it detracts from the gameplay. The overall thing that this stage has going for it is there are these long stretches where you're not doing anything but running forward. That was probably because of this gimmick that they included here. They felt like they had to make these long stretches to account for the pressing gimmick that launches you into the air. But it's so boring. You're just running along, running straight ahead for these long sections, these long stretches of this map. Act 2 does redeem things a little bit with a much less intrusive gimmick, where if you don't flip a switch every 30 seconds or so, then you just die. You're insta-killed. But then you have these spinning ball mechanism things that are very unintuitive and very annoying to have to deal with. I mean, Act 2 does pick the pace up a bit more, and it is generally a more enjoyable act, but again, there's just too many gimmicks bogging it down. Press Factory Zone's going to the very bottom, where we're gonna forget it ever happened. There's one more zone here that I need to squeeze in at the bottom tier, and that is Sand Sanctuary Zone. Sand Sanctuary Zone is not a bad zone, but it's also not a good zone. I would call it the definition of a mid-zone. You're in a sand situation, like a desert situation here, which is, you know, a decent concept that's been done better in previous Sonic games. Pretty much all it has going for it is there's this giant snake that's leading you along through the whole thing, and while you are riding this giant snake, it does give you opportunities to like build lots of speed really quickly, and you can potentially launch yourself into the air to make for some fun set pieces. But there's just too many sections where there's quicksand that immediately slows you down. There's too many sand waterfall things where you have to climb a sand fall to get to an upper section, which also slows you down. And then there's just very uninspired platforming sections combined with lots of just cheap enemy placement and enemies that are trying to slow you down. Sand Sanctuary, there's nothing wrong with it, but there's really just nothing going for it at the same time. So, very forgettable stage, we're putting it at the very bottom rung. Alright, so we've gotten rid of all of the crap, we've cut the fat of Sonic Superstars, so now let's move forward to the stages that definitely deserve at least a little bit of respect. The next stage I want to talk about here is Bridge Island Zone. Bridge Island Zone is a very decent, very solid introductory stage to Sonic Superstars. It has those Green Hill Zone vibes going for it. What Bridge Island Zone does for you is it wants you to explore. It's a very exploration heavy stage, and it's also a very vertical stage on top of that. Pretty much right out the gate in Zone 1, you are presented with pretty much every path conceivable in the zone. It'll essentially give you various opportunities to jump right up to the top of the stage, jump right to the middle, and that's pretty cool. You know, you can choose to either speed through this thing and ignore all those paths and secrets, or you can choose to jump up to a different path, either via the waterfalls or just through floating platforms. I guess the issue that I have with this is that if you just don't explore at all, you can blow through this way too fast, and by the time you reach the end of it, you feel like not a whole lot has happened. Nothing about this stage really grabs your attention. Act 2 is also guilty of this. Act 2 is essentially an identical version of Act 1, except for the sun is set on the whole thing rather than it being, you know, the middle of the day. And it's just the same act repeated twice, where you have access to all these paths vertically, and that's about it. So a lot of this zone is kind of what you make it. I wouldn't recommend blowing through this zone, because if you do, then it's a very disappointing zone. Speed Jungle Zone, I feel like a lot of people are going to say that this is the best zone in the game. I could definitely agree with a lot of points that they make. This is, I mean, it's in the name, Speed Jungle Zone. It's all about going fast, maintaining momentum, and Act 1 is a lot of fun. I don't really have much to say about Act 1 other than it's super fun, and while it may be short, that's kind of the idea, because it's a speed-based zone. If you can get really good at this zone, you can breeze through it really quickly, because you are riding along these vines, you are running along at a really quick pace. Also, they mix things up by shooting missiles at you while you're on the vines, which allow for an opportunity for you to be able to dodge them and get better at, I guess, just your reflex skills. Act 2, however, is where I feel like the biggest problem is this whole gimmick where every now and then you essentially can't see anything around you. And while that does kind of add to the vibes, like, of it being like a dark, interesting forest, it doesn't really do much else other than, you know, limit what you can see going on in front of you. So what will happen is you will be in these very dark situations, and you will feel like you have to take these leaps of faith just to hopefully advance in the stage. And on top of that, there will randomly be these rocks in your way that'll just completely just stop you in your tracks. And I hate when Sonic stages do this, because it just defeats the whole purpose, in my opinion. So, while Speed Jungle Zone is a really fun, solid stage across both acts, the second act kind of bogs it down because of its silly, unnecessary gimmick of just completely halting your vision. So, unfortunately, I cannot consider Speed Jungle to be the best stage in the game. Now we have Sky Temple, and this is an interesting zone because it's the first zone in the game where it's not 2 acts, but just one big act. So as this big 1-act zone, Sky Temple has a very awe-inspiring, very, I guess just spectacle-heavy gimmick of you being up in the sky. And it has really awesome music. I think this stage might have the best music out of all the stages in the game, and so that definitely bumps it up for me. That being said, there's only so far a stage can be carried off of its cool gimmick. Now, while the setting is really awesome, in my opinion, it's really just cool, the stage itself just doesn't have a lot of substance to it. There are these very half-assed platforming sections where you're not doing a whole lot. They decided to throw a dozen enemies in your path in an attempt to make these sections interesting. But it doesn't do that. It doesn't make them interesting, it just makes them annoying. Then you have a shit ton of these ray guns that are shooting at you during these sections. Again, they were probably put there to beef up these sections because they're very uninspired. But all it does is just take away from the experience further. While there is that end section where you are climbing up in the sky and you're climbing higher and higher, which I do think is cool, again, it's just very uninspired platforming, just a very uninspiring stage all across the board. Pinball Carnival Zone. This zone is, I'm just going to say it out the gate, this zone is up there. This zone is definitely getting a pass from me. Pinball Carnival reminds me a lot of Studiopolis Zone from Sonic Mania, which is one of my favorite Sonic zones ever. It's a fun time. It feels like everything's a party in this game. And you have the slight pinball gimmick, which is done expertly here, where you are using these flippers to launch you up to higher parts of the map. And not only are there the higher parts to explore, there's the lower parts and there's the middle part of the zone. All these paths just mesh so well together and you can explore them all at your whim. It just feels like a party here, and I love how the stage's gimmicks allow you to weave through all of these different paths in such a smooth and seamless way. And it's just so much fun. I love the vibes here, and all around it's just a very solid, excellent zone. Act 1 and Act 2 complement each other so well, and there's enough differences between them that make them extremely fun to play and never a dull moment. I love Pinball Carnival Zone. It's definitely getting that green check mark from me. Now we have Lagoon City Zone, and I really wanted this zone to be an amazing zone because I love the water vibes. I'm a sucker for those as well. Lagoon City has a lot going for it. Act 1 is a very platforming heavy zone. You don't really find yourself underwater a lot of the time, which is always a great plus for a Sonic game. And it's just a fun act. I really don't know what else to say about it. But the problem is it's extremely short and it just flies by before you even know you're done with it. And it's honestly disappointing in that regard because I would have loved to see it get fleshed out more. Act 2 really wants you to exist underwater. It's really just forcing you down into these giant underwater sections that are really slow, really plodding, even slower than previous underwater sections in other Sonic games. I mean, Sonic Superstars is already a slightly slower game, so when it forces you to be underwater half the time, that just makes it worse. Not to mention that these underwater sections have nothing going for them. I mean, they're just these big open areas that you have to trudge along through, and there's just a crap ton of enemies put in your path that are trying to slow you down. Again, we have a situation here where, in order to compensate for an uninspiring section in a level, a bunch of enemies are put in your path in an attempt to cover that up. So unfortunately, Lagoon City Zone, even though it has an amazing vibe, I just can't call it one of the top tier zones in this game. Alright, so we just have a handful of zones here left. We have Golden Capital Zone. And in terms of creativity, I'd say Golden Capital is one of the top zones. It's a very interesting situation here. It's almost like a city of gold in a sense, like an El Dorado type situation where everything is about money, everything is about gold. I mean, this stage just throws rings at you left and right. Like by the time you're done with this zone, you will have upwards of 400 to 500 rings in your pocket. It's amazing. Once again, the flippers are brought back, and once again, there's a bunch of bumpers that are brought back, which you can make the argument that, well, we've been here and done that in previous zones, so why are they here all of a sudden? And I agree that is kind of cheap how they're just brought back, but I think the creativity of the zone in general makes up for that. Act 1 in general, just it keeps you going, it keeps the pace up, and there's nothing here that really slows you down. I mean, it almost has those party vibes to it, like Pinball Carnival does, and I really like that about it. You know, you do get the sense though that it overdoes it with the bumpers and the pinball pads, and I can see that. I feel like it does try too hard to throw you into these big sections where you're just kind of bouncing off stuff and you can't really get anywhere because there's just too much crap just bouncing you around. But Act 2 is where all those problems cease to exist. It's a much more concise platforming act. It's a really, really strong act. And I really wish that Act 1 had been more like Act 2, so that way we would get some more positive consistency across the board. Unfortunately, it doesn't do that. But because Act 1 is a bit bogged down with too many bumpers, too many sections that are just crazy and make no sense, I unfortunately cannot consider Golden Capital Zone to be a top tier zone. It's a great zone, but it just misses the mark. Cyber Station Zone, this is again another Mammoth Act zone, and it is a great one. It is awesome. I love the pixelated environment that we are existing within here. It just adds a flavor that we haven't seen much in Sonic games, and I love that so much about it. Cyber Station Zone is very well constructed. You have the ability to weave through top paths and bottom paths at your will, and I love that about it. That's one of the best things about a Sonic game that it can be, and it's just a fun zone. There are sections here where you will be morphed into a octopus, and this doesn't detract at all. It is fun to be able to fly through these little platforming sections as a squid. The mouse sections are probably the low point of Cyber Station, unfortunately. You have these mouse sections where you have to climb up these rods and avoid the enemies to make it to the top, and the pace is still, you know, picking up here. It's not slowing down by any means, so really I don't see much of a problem. Cyber Station Zone is just a party, just like, you know, previous zones, and I love the gimmick and I love everything about it. It's just so much fun to be in and so much fun to breeze through. Here's the thing. I would say that Pinball Carnival does a much better job of just keeping a seamless pace going here. Cyber Station Zone's various paths are much more funneled, and because of that, whenever its gimmicks do get in the way, you feel like you have no choice but to go in the direction that it wants you to go. It almost forces you along certain paths at the sake of its gimmicks. So, I would say that Pinball Carnival is the best zone in Sonic Superstars because it strikes that perfect balance that we all look for in all Sonic stages. It's fun to play, it's very speedy, it's very exploration heavy, there's lots of secrets, and its gimmick doesn't get in the way of you enjoying all of that. So Pinball Carnival, you son of a bitch, you win the game. I'm not sure what to call this, but you are the best zone in Sonic Superstars, hands down. I love Pinball Carnival Zone. It's so much fun, and I will probably never get sick of it, and it's definitely one of the best zones in Sonic history. You know, at the end of the day, if we had to put a big red bow on all of this, we had to wrap everything up all nice and tight, I would say that Sonic Superstars zones are, in general, very all over the place. In terms of how these zones rank in the history of all Sonic stages, unfortunately the bulk of these zones I don't think will stand the test of time as classic Sonic zones. I think a lot of them will be lost to time and will be forgotten. But hey, at the end of the day, most of these zones are good enough that they make for a consistent experience playing Sonic Superstars. But yeah, anyways, I'm Marky Mark, I'm out. Let me know your favorite zone in the comments below. Also, this whole video was just a bit. I actually think Egg Fortress Zone is the best fucking Sonic zone of all time.